Many of you were very interested in our history pieces done about the Sega systems released in the United States. Even more people in the forums were interested about us doing a similar history piece about the NEC systems like the PC Engine and the TurboGrafx. While we're not quite ready to be able to do one of those pieces just yet, we did want to take a look at a piece of the history of NEC through their release of the arcade card. The arcade card was an addition that you added to the PC Engine system, allowing you to play a series of games, a very few amount of games, but a series of games that might be interesting. They were never released in the United States, and I wanted to take a look at a few of them now, as well as this card itself. So have a look.
The TurboGrafx 16 was released by NEC in North America on August 29, 1989. It was stunning, new, it pushed the envelope of console gaming, and it was a miserable failure of marketing and imagination in the United States. The TurboGrafx was released 2 weeks after the Sega Genesis, and from that point forward, it would always try to play catch-up to Sega's 16-bit wonder. At its core, the TurboGrafx 16 was actually an 8-bit machine with an 8-bit microprocessor. It was, however, supported with a dedicated 16-bit graphics processor, custom video encoder, and superior sound chip. In many ways, it looked better than the Genesis, but it still felt like an NES. Soon after the release of the console, NEC launched the first CD-ROM attachment in the US. The prohibitive launch price of $399 and the lack of a pack-in game and a small number of titles continued to keep this system down. Even the Turbo Duo, released only a couple years later in direct competition with the Sega CD, was too little too late for this underrated system. Now, before I get out of control and go into the full history, the implications, and the contributions that the TurboGrafx 16 had in the United States, I'm going to stop myself. But let's pretend for a moment that you lived in Japan. In Japan, the PC Engine was king. It was released a full 2 years earlier in 1987, and it quickly gained numbers that rivaled Nintendo's Famicom. Yes, in Japan it was even bigger than Nintendo. It was much more popular than Sega's Mega Drive, and while the Super Famicom boasted stronger graphical and audio specs 3 years later in 1990, NEC and Hudson's little PC Engine continued to live strong. In Japan, the CD system attachment was a big success, boasting original role-playing games, anime-styled action games, puzzle games, and even some adult erotic titles. As technology increased, so did the NEC CD technology. The PC Engine CD system did not have any built-in onboard RAM. This lack of memory created the need for the PC Engine system card to come packed in with the first PC Engine CD system. Version 1.0 of the card contained 1 MB of RAM, allowing the CD games to load and run. Soon after, the updated versions 2.0 and 2.1 were released, still providing the 1 MB of RAM, but updating the system BIOS and fixing some bugs. These cards allowed for the use of the Cd-Rom 2 games, sometimes referred to as Cd-Rom-ROM or Cd-Rom squared. In 1991, the first big improvement was released in Japan as NEC put out the Super Cd-Rom 2 3.0 system card with 1.5 MB of RAM. This card was released in North America 1 year later, but it was upgraded to version 3.01. This card allowed your Turbo CD to play the improved Super CD games with more music, voice, graphical capabilities, and superior gameplay. This allowed your PC Engine or Turbo CD system to be exactly the same as the newly released Turbo Duo system. These Super CDs had some of the most memorable games released for the platform, such as Dracula X, Rondo of Blood, Snatcher, and Gates of Thunder. In the USA, this was the last gasp of the TurboGrafx. When the Sega CD was victorious in the CD-ROM war and Super Nintendo ran away with it all, the TurboGrafx in the US was no more. However, back east, the Super System CD games continued to be a success. While Americans' memory of the TurboGrafx had all but completely faded away, NEC and Hudson had one last release in Japan to help combat the growing popularity of Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse, and the Horizon looking as if it would belong to the Sony PlayStation and Sega's Saturn. In 1994, NEC released the arcade card. While the original system card had 1 MB of RAM, and the Super System card had 1.5 megabytes of RAM. The arcade card had an astonishing 17.5 megabytes of RAM, allowing for some serious animation and graphical capabilities. This created one kick-ass 8-bit system. There were two versions of the arcade card. The arcade card Duo, which added the additional 16 megabytes of RAM to the Duo system's built-in 1.5, and the arcade card Pro, which was specifically for the original PC Engine CD system, packing in all 17.5 megabytes in one shot. Because of the late release of the arcade card and its extraordinarily high price, developers were not overly enthusiastic about the format, and very few games were ever released before the PC Engine's survival finally came to an end. But this powerful add-on did have a few titles of note. The capabilities of the card were shown in a few ports of well-known Neo Geo fighting games. These ports of World Heroes 2, Fatal Fury Special, and Art of Fighting showed some amazing graphical animation, and they were worthy counterparts to the original Neo Geo versions. While this was a nice feat of programming and an interesting way for the PC Engine to evolve, people wanted much more out of this than what they ended up getting. Regardless of a few fighting games, that didn't keep a few quality titles from appearing on the scene. The most noticeable title released for the arcade card was the very rare Ginga Bouquet Densetsu Sapphire, or Sapphire for short. This top-down shooter showed some incredible graphics, and showed what the card could do. As can be seen here, some of the game's enemies even have polygon shapes and shadings reminiscent of Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. Other titles included a version of Strider, as well as another shooter named Mad Stalker. About 12 or so titles in all required the arcade card to play, but there were even more titles that played with the Super CD-Rom 2 card, but were actually enhanced by using the arcade card. Most of these enhancements occurred during non-playable elements, such as in-game cinemas. A great example of this is the opening cinema for 3x3 Eyes, an adventure game based off the anime series in Japan. Check out the differences between the cinemas when using the Super CD card versus the arcade CD card. Not only are there full animations running much more smoothly with the arcade card, but the music is all preloaded and CD quality as well. However, the need to preload cinemas actually took some time before the game even loaded. In the case of 3x3 Eyes, check out the countdown screen that's necessary for the game to load the cinemas. This is pretty ridiculous, and you thought the Sega CD had long load times. But in the end, these animations more than rival any animations for the Sega CD or any other console system until the PlayStation and Saturn were released. In order to use the card on a US system, you must have a HuCard adapter, such as the Casado converter, that allows Japanese cards to work on the US systems. In conjunction with the arcade card, you can turn your Turbo CD or Turbo Duo into the most powerful 8-bit system you can imagine. Now, anyone who watches this program probably knows that the TurboGrafx and PC Engine are my favorite systems of all time. I feel this way mostly due to the complicated and interesting history surrounding the NEC systems in both Japan and the US. In one country, it was so incredibly popular, and in another, so much the opposite. When looked at thoroughly, this dichotomy can help explain the cultural differences and styles that have always separated Japanese gamers and US gamers. But that's for another time. What is most disappointing to me is that the arcade card, the swan song for the PC Engine, never had the opportunity to reach its true potential. The unique and artistic games released over the years for the PC Engine were what made the system stand out among all others. If those same designers had the time to tap the potential of the arcade card, perhaps even more memorable games could have been made.